Hello and welcome to your next tutorial in C++, and today we're going to be discussing multidimensional arrays and how to pass them as parameters as well. So I'm going to kind of use the example I was using in the last tutorial, and I also want to point out if you have not watched any of my previous tutorials, you might have a problem with this one because this is where we are a little bit advanced, because I know a lot of people sometimes jump partway into my playlists and then it gets really overwhelming. If you have not watched my previous videos, then this might be a very overwhelming video. So if you're only looking for multidimensional arrays without all this other advanced stuff, oh jeez, not here. Well, okay, so first of all, what is the multidimensional array? Well, I would like you to first visualize what single-dimensional arrays, what we have already been dealing with, look like. So I'm going to open this poorly designed thing I made in Paint, and this is a single-dimensional array here, basically. We might have created an array, and maybe we put in 3 scores for one student, maybe. Or maybe this is 3 different tests. And let's say this is student 1. Yeah, let's look at it this way. Let's say this is just one test, and we had student 1, student 2, and student 3. That's how they each did on the first test. Student 1 got an 85, student 2 got a 95, 90. Well, do we really want to have to create a new array for every test that we have? That's kind of tedious. So we could use a 2-dimensional array. Now, how do you visualize a 2-dimensional array? We'll kind of visualize it as if having an x and a y axis. So the first column is still student 1's scores, the second one is still student 2's, and the third one student 3's. And you can kind of look at the coordinates for them. Now, bear in mind, and I will show you this again later, remind you that these do not work like your typical xy coordinates. They're actually flip-flopped. If you're into math and you don't know graphing, this should be 1, 0, not 0, 1. But it is 0, 1. And that's because the first number, and this is usually how you refer to it. Remember we would type in the array name followed by bracket 0 bracket? This is how you refer to them, with multidimensional arrays. Specifically here, just 2, because you just have 2 numbers. But yeah, the first one always represents what row number. So this is all the first row right here. So they all have zeros in the front. And the second number refers to the column. So this whole first column here, they all have zeros here for the second number. All of them here are 1s, and all of them here are 2s. So bear that in mind. So I'm going to minimize this. Now let's actually figure out how to create our multidimensional array. So I'll still call it int scores, but all you have to do is put 2 brackets. But before we actually put any numbers in here, I have to actually type the rows and columns up here. So I'll call it const int, and you know what, just for simplicity's sake, so it's easy for you to visualize, I'll just call them rows. I was going to call one scores, then the other one students, but nah. So rows. So how many rows are we going to have in our example? We're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 rows. So I'll put a 4 there, and then another const int, and I'll call it columns, and I'll set that equal to, and how many columns do we have? 3. We had 3 different students. So 4 different tests and 3 different students. So that's all we need to know. So basically we could throw in our rows is what's represented in the first one, then the columns is represented in the second. Then if we already know the scores, then we could just throw them all in here. So how do you write out multidimensional arrays in here? Well, since we're dealing with rows and columns, basically we can group each test within here. So we have 4 tests. So if you want to think about it this way, each one of these group of brackets will represent a row. Then the columns is the actual numbers that you put in here. So each of these will be your rows. So that's basically for us the different tests. And then in each one we put our group of information. So our first one has 80, 90, 99. So I'm just going to make up numbers. So 80, 90, 99, whoops, 900. And if you put in another one, then we're going to get an error. See that? See too many values. So we can only have 3 in this group, because for columns we only said 3. So then here, I don't know, 60, 70, 80, just whatever you'd like. 40, 50, whoops, 50, 20, then over here 10, 0, 0. That person is terrible over there. So now we have all of our information put in here. if you know, I also want to point out, if you actually know what you're going to be putting in here, and you just print it like this, you actually don't need to put in how many rows. This is actually optional. Even if you don't know, so if I just cut all this, so let me just Control X, and you just did like this, then, well, now it's incomplete, so it doesn't always work. But if you do know, whoops, I have to throw my equal sign. But again, if you do know what you're going to be typing in, then you actually don't have to put in the number of rows, because remember, if you look at this, you remember how when we put in what we already knew for a single dimensional array, and if we already knew what to put in, we didn't have to put a value here? Well, that's because it knew that there was going to only be one row. But here, see, if I put this out, so you notice how we only have one row for a single dimensional array. It knew that there's only going to be one when we typed in the information, so we didn't have to worry about anything. But here, it's a little different, so here it's a little different, so you have to put down the number of columns, so it's a bit complicated. But don't really worry about this, because this is not how you're going to usually do this anyways. Usually, you're going to have to put in the information yourself. But anyways, I'm just going to show you quickly how to print the information. So in order to print it, just type out scores, and then those guys, and, well, the row and column we want. So, what row do we want to go into? Let's go into the first row. The first row is 0, and let's go for the second column. So that should give us this 90. So this is the first row, and then within this first row, we have our first column and second column. So we should get our 90 printed. So if I run this, there's our 90, so it worked. And an easier way to look at this is, you remember in, I don't know if you remember this, but you remember when you declare variables, you could go int, num1, put a comma, enter, num2, comma, num3 equals 4, comma, and so on. Well, you can actually print out your multidimensional array like this too, to make it easier to read as rows and columns. So I could actually put, whoa, I didn't want that to happen. Oh, come on. That's not, I'm sorry, that's not how I wanted this to enter here. So let me just get it over as, there we go. And let's throw this one down now. I thought I was going to do it automatically, but you can also do it this way. Whoops. And then you can see it this way too. So this is row 1, this is row 2, this is row 1, and you have our columns. So it's a lot easier to look at it that way. So as you can see in row 0, which is our first one, then in the column 2, actually went over here, I forgot. I meant to do that one. But oh well, it's still printed 90 as it's supposed to. So let's try looking for another one. So let's look for the 40. So what row is that? That's the third row, so that's row number 2. Index number 2, really. And it's in the second column, so we just keep the 1. So that should print us 40. And there it is. Okay, so everything worked. But we're not going to be dealing with it like this. We're not going to be doing this. Instead, we're going to be doing as we've always been doing, and that's passing them into functions. So we're going to throw out int scores, and now we're going to need both our rows and our columns defined. So rows will go there, and columns will go there. So let's actually figure out how to get this in. Oh man, I didn't prepare this. Oh, and I really need to figure out how to do this. So let's go void, and what's going to be fill scores? I don't know. And inside here we'll need our parameters. So we have ints, this guy, and I don't think we're going to need a number of elements. And then inside here we're going to have to throw in our 2 variables. And believe it or not, you don't actually have to put in your rows there. But I'm going to anyways because it makes me feel more comfortable. You don't have to, but I will. And am I going to be using a num of elements? No, I'm not going to use the num of elements because we have a set number of students, which is determined by the columns. This is our number of students, so we don't need a number of elements. So that's all we're going to be doing with that. So let's go fill scores. Then we're going to go, man, if anyone's watching this without knowing what I'm doing, this is going to be a tough video for them. scores and or scores of all tests from students. I don't know, something like that. And I think that's all it's going to do. And let's actually prepare our other function too. So that's going to be void print scores. And I believe all that's going to need is the same thing. So int, and then rows and columns. There we go. And same thing. So print scores. Is that what I called it? Yep. And I'll just copy and paste this to make it easier because it's the same parameter. I'm thinking about how difficult these videos must be getting all of a sudden. This is probably like, you know, just way up there now. Okay, so let's continue this. So we already typed this out, so let's just type out our print again. So void fill scores. Okay, scores, something like that. Then in here we'll type out int, and I'll just call them new scores with our little brackets. Remember, the brackets don't go right after the data type; they go after the name in the actual definition. Then I thought rows and columns, and yeah, that's all we needed. So, and not a semicolon. What was I thinking? I wasn't. And okay, so now let's actually print out our code. So, well, the first thing we need to do is create an integer data type called score, which we're going to be using to collect the information. Then I'm going to use a for loop this time, because since we're not going to be checking to see whether or not they typed, -1 or something like that, like we did before, we don't have to worry about using a while loop. I'm just going to use a for loop. So it's going to be int I is equal to 0. Then I is less than. Now remember, this time we're going to be looking to see how many tests there are first. And so since we're dealing with multidimensional arrays, obviously we're going to have to be worried about nested loops. So this parent loop will first see how many tests there are. Then the nested loop will be the loop that actually puts in the scores for each of those tests. So if we're going to be dealing with tests and this one, we're going to want how many tests we have, which is, well, 4 different tests. So that's our rows. Rows equals 4. So I'll type out while I is less than rows, and then I plus, and then our code will go inside here. So the first thing I'm going to have is cout, and have it say enter scores for test number, and then in order to get what test number, just add 1 to whatever I is, because you don't want the first one to say enter scores for test number 0. So I'll just throw a +1 in there, and then another string that will just be a colon and a semicolon. There we go. And then they'll just type out their information after that. So typically what I've done before for like the checks and whatever is I would have the cin right here for the scores, and then below that I would do the while loop. But since we're not worrying about that now, since we don't have to worry about checks or anything like that, we're actually just going to put the cin inside the loop itself. And that's only if you remembered my last tutorial. I did the cin up here, but I'm just going to put it down in there. So I'll have int j is equal to 0. And this time, since we're going to be typing in the actual scores, we want it to be less than how many students there are, how many scores are we going to have. So that's going to be the columns. Because remember, we only have 3 students. So I know this is just so much more complicated than what we've done. This is accelerated so much. And then inside our little for loop, then we'll have the cin for scores, because we don't have to check it or anything like that. And, whoops, did I spell everything? Oh, I just said score. And then, there we go. So then we go new scores. Then what test number? Well, the very first time we go in our parent loop, the very first time we're in the parent loop, we'll be dealing with row number 0, which is the first test. So the first thing we would do is put an I there. Then the next one will be j, which is the actual test number. So as we're going through this loop, this j will keep incrementing, and this I will stay at 0. So the very first time it's going in that loop, I will stay 0, which is the row, so 0, 0, 0. And as it goes through it 3 times, it'll go for that's 0, that's 1, that's 2. Then once it's equal to 3, once j is equal to 3, it'll exit this loop and then continue the parent for loop, thus raising I up to 1. So then it'll go into this loop again, then while I is 1, plug in j equals 0, 1, and 2 for these 3 scores. And I'll keep doing it 4 times. So I know that's kind of hard to visualize, but that is how it works. So yeah. And by the way, if you're having any difficult understanding this, just watch it again. Eventually it will get in, don't worry. This isn't too bad. And is that all I wanted this to do? Yeah, that's all this function will do. So now we'll need a void print scores. And just like before, we'll have to throw out our multi-dimensional array. I'll call it new scores. And then this will be rows, and this will be columns. So now this one is the much more different. This one's probably actually really easy for you to visualize and understand. This one is going to be a little bit difficult. So the first thing I'm going to do is have my for loop, my parent for loop. Now since this time, in this loop, what we did is we went through each test. We went through each test in this for loop, and inside each test we submitted the students' scores. But this time we want to look at each student first, then look at each of their scores. So this one's going to be a little backwards. So for int I is equal to 0, we're going to go i's less than the columns this time. Because this time this parent loop is only going to go through the 3 students. Then the nested loop will go through each of their scores. So for each student we look at, for each I, we're going to look through 4 different j's. So it's a little backwards on this one. But hopefully that's pretty easy to visualize and understand. Then in here we'll have something that says like cout scores, or how about this? Students, and then we'll have I plus 1. Whoops. There we go. Okay. And so it will say student 1 scores colon space. There we go. And then after that we'll have our nested for loop, which will, print each of that student at that certain index, each of their scores. So this time we'll have int j is equal to 0. J is less than the rows this time, and then j plus plus. At this point, I'm starting to think I shouldn't have called these rows and columns. I think I should have called them, tests and then students. That might have been easier, but oh well, I did what I did. So then cout, and then we'll print, well, whatever they had. So new scores at, but this time, again, since this is a little backwards, we're going to be going j first, then I. So remember that. So it's a little backwards this time. So as j keeps changing, so remember, let's look at this. So it's going to look at I, so it's going to look at the student, right? So each of the columns, so if I is 0, it's going to look at each of these students. Then basically the way to remember is this is j and I, because since I is the column's the second one, remember? So that's why we're putting I there. So you know what, I was about to explain it much more difficult. That's an easier way to remember. Since now we're associating I with the columns instead of I with the rows, we now have to put I in the column one, which is the second one. And yeah, j's with the rows, so now it's the first one. So that's why with that one. And we'll probably want an extra empty string to space out the scores. So I'll click save, and now let's run this. So, oh, whoops. I didn't unreference local variable the scores, because I didn't, sorry about that. So fill scores, and in there we'll just pass in scores, and then print scores. And there we go. And I'll click save all, and now I'll run this. Okay, so now I'm going to put in my information. So let's actually use the information from this one here. So the first person got an 80, then a 9, or the first test. This is the first test in each of the 3 students. So the first student got an 80, and the next student got a 90, then the next one got a 99. Good job. Then the next one got on the next test, the first one got a 72, then an 87, then a 96. Then test number 3, hopefully you can all see that, 54, then a 77, then an 88. And then for the last one, they got a 0. Ooh. then a 78, then an 84. I'll click enter, and ooh, how ugly is that? So that's actually pretty ugly. Let me fix that really quickly. Okay, so as you can see, I just put an end line here for the print scores. So I'll save that and let's run it. And oh darn, I closed it. Massively long video, holy mackerel. And 84. Okay, so let's look at this. So we have student 1 scores an 80, which they did. So remember, these are each of the students, the columns, and these are, you know, each of the tests for each of the students. So the first one, on the first test, they got an 80, which they did. On the second test, they got a 72, and it's printed there. Then 54, then a 0. So it all worked out. Then this column, which is kind of off now because student number 1 got a 0, they start out with a 90, then an 87, 77, 78, then a 99, 96, 88, and 84. So that all worked out. So this was a really complicated tutorial, but most likely you won't really have to worry about multidimensional arrays, at least not in a college course. I don't think they mess with them that much, but I would like to go through this and explain this again, but I really think I did it to the best of my abilities. This is hard. So I'm going to leave it right here so you can see the code. And anyways, I really hope this tutorial was helpful for you. That's the point. And I really didn't want to show you, you know, an easy, you know, just type out if you know it, you know, equal to braces, because that's what all other tutorials do. They're not really good with their examples. I wanted to show you a good example here, so I really hope it was. I really hope this made it easier for you to work with multi-dimensional arrays, and I'll see you next time.